Recording in progress.
Kia ora koutou katoa. I begin by acknowledging the land and the ancestors of Rangitane, whose manaki, love, care, and knowledge shape these infrastructures where we have these conversations. These conversations are a reminder that decolonization is ongoing work of interrogating the ways in which structures erase knowledge systems and knowledge registers. I am delighted to welcome you to this lecture in the CARE series on futures of applied communication research. And it's such a joy to have with us today Professor Debbie Dougherty talking about beyond binary thinking in applied communication. Professor Dougherty is Professor of Communication at the University of Missouri. Her research focuses on power and organizing, demonstrating the best of communication research in the context of developing applications and the ways in which systematic thinking about communicative processes and power can shape how we design interventions addressing issues such as sexual harassment. Her work on power and organizing particularly relate to the context of sexual harassment, social class, and emotions. And she has published in a wide range of journals that go from communication to organizing to business, including top-notch publications such as the Harvard Business Review, Human Relations, Journal of Communication, Human Communication Research, Communication Monographs, Management Communication Quarterly, Journal of Applied Communication Research, and Sex Roles. That just gives you a sense of the breadth of Debbie's work, but also gives you a sense of the ways in which systematic theorizing of communicative processes can help us understand diverse range of phenomena, including in the context of organizing in businesses. She has provided training related to organizational communication and development in a number of organizations and has been extensively utilized as a resource for news media, including such sources as the New York Times, Newsweek, Forbes, and the Oprah Magazine. So Debbie is in many ways an exemplar of the kind of applied communication scholar whose work is publicly engaged and has played a critical role both in the context of informing organizational policies as well as in the development of interventions. Professor Dougherty has received a number of awards, including the Organizational Communication Book of the Year and Textbook of the Year Award, the NCA Applied Communication Scholar Award, the Jack Kay Award for Engaged Research, the Management Communication Quarterly Article of the Year Award, the Norman K. Denson Qualitative Research Award, the Excellence in Education Award, and the Gold Chalk Award for Graduate Student Mentoring. At a very personal note, when I took over the editorship of the Journal of Applied Communication Research from Debbie, one of the things I was most amazed by is the ways in which, as the editor of Jacker, she created and opened up spaces for diverse forms of applied communication scholarship, a conversation that she really started and played a critical role in that continues to develop and flourish. So thank you, Debbie, for your leadership, and looking forward to having you in this conversation and learning from you.
Thank you, Mohan. You made me sound kind of awesome, so I really do appreciate that. I've been thinking about binaries for a very long time throughout my career, and I really started to drill down on what does binary thinking do? What is it and what does it do, especially in applied context? For those of us who do applied scholarship, it really matters how we think about something beyond just getting items published, because it impacts our world, and how we impact our world is important. And so having something like binary shaping our thinking is fundamentally important as we move forward with our work. And so this is a continuation of my theorizing that I started in my book, and I'm sort of developing further into other contexts. So I just, first of all, would like you to do this one little task for me. I want you to tell me what is the opposite of a lion. I can't, let's see. You can put it in chat if you want to, or you can just kind of put it in your head. Curious to see, what is the opposite of a lion? All right. I'm assuming you've at least done this in your heads. You're thinking about it. Here's some of the things that people have come up with. A rabbit. In fact, this one was really interesting. The person who came up with the rabbit said, I don't think it's a binary, but if it was a binary, I would say rabbit. Right? A mouse. A lamb. And a lioness, which is fascinating because that's playing on the gender binaries, right? And even if you don't think of an exact opposite, your brain is trained to think that way. So most of us go, what is the opposite of a lion? And you start to think, what's the opposite of a lion? Even though there's no opposite of a lion. That's not a thing. So today I want to first talk about what is a binary logic. And then I want to define binary language and to talk more about how we come to think about our world as oppositional. And then consider how applied communication is limited by these binary logics, and then provide some tools for thinking beyond binaries. So we'll start with binary logics. And binary logics are the way we're taught to structure social meaning through this oppositional thinking. And we just automatically go there. So what is the opposite of a lion? Well, there is no opposite of a lion, but we're still thinking there's an opposite, and we search for the opposite. And why do we do this? And it's not just in the English language. This is Western languages, many Asian languages. It seems to be something that has been colonized across time. So we're trained to see the world as oppositional from a very, very young age. In fact, I have 3 children, and all 3 of my children were gifted books, different books, about opposites. This is one by Sandra Boynton that my children really, really loved. There were other ones called like the Baby Book of Opposite. And I've been told that if children are not able to identify opposites by a particular age, like 2 or 3, they are considered language delayed at least in the English culture, within the English language. And so we are taught from a very, very young age to think about the world as oppositional. And so our language creates the impression that the physical and social worlds are built around oppositions, opposites. And sometimes it makes sense, right? In, out, up, down, these are true opposites, but not always in the physical world. Like, you know, what's the opposite of a lion? Or what's the opposite of a sheep? Cat? What's the opposite of a book? Not a book, right? There's no opposites of these things, and yet we're taught to think in this particular way. But in the social world, opposites rarely make sense. They really don't. So consider for a moment some of these standard oppositional thinkings. We think of emotionality as the opposite of rationality. This is especially in organizational context, but also in the home. Yet, research is extremely clear. You cannot be rational if you have not engaged the emotion-centered piece of your brain. You can't make even the most simple of decisions, like what am I going to eat today, or what color of socks am I going to wear, if the emotion-centered piece of your brain has been somehow disabled. And so they're not opposite. They're actually intertwined parts of the same thing. Masculinity and femininity. We talk about men and women, or masculinity and femininity, as if they are opposites. And yet, men and women and people who identify as masculine and feminine behave almost identically. There is a 0.3% difference in terms of how we behave as leaders or as spouses or whatever. And yet we still think of men and women as literally opposite of each other. Even the notion of right and wrong, we think of as oppositional, and yet very often it's perspectival. What is right in one context may be perceived as wrong in another. And so it really doesn't make sense to frame our world, our social world, in these opposites. And so why do we do this? Why do we frame our social world in opposites? Well, we're trained to do that. And also, it really creates this hypersimplification of a very complex world. We find ourselves needing to simplify the connections, and binaries is one way to do that. So we get these really fascinating binaries that are not actually binaries. Male, female, cat, dog. The idea that women are then associated with cats and men are associated with dogs, and men are opposite from women and cats are opposite from dogs, gets us these really weird things like a phenomenon like Vance's, in the US, recent, not too recent actually, discussion of crazy cat ladies are women who don't have children. Fascinating. Or stand and sit. Are those really opposite? How about stand and lay down? Ice and fire, are they opposite, or are they just different things? So there's these 6 facets of binary logics that I think would really help us, I believe help us think more clearly about the binary logic driving our language and our worlds. So first of all, binary logics shape meaning. Binary logics structure our social world. Binary logics are seeped in power and privilege. Binary logics are interwoven. And binary logics are intersectional. I'll talk briefly about each of these things. So first of all, binary logics shape meaning. These are like how we make sense of our world. And meaning, of course, is restrained by these cultural rules. Culture tells us what meaning is, what something means. And cultural rules are both shape and they're shaped by language. And binary language is a cultural rule. So men is opposite of women is a meaning. Those are meaning systems, and they're oppositional meaning systems. The takeaway from this simply is that language is formed around binary logics, and binaries are really hard to see. We don't recognize them when we're using them. And binaries shape the very possibility of meanings. If everything's oppositional, our meanings are going to be oppositional as well. Second, binary language shapes social structure. It provides a structure around which meaning is created, opposites. And here's a great example of this that I thought was just absolutely fascinated me. Facebook has actually coded binary gender into their platform. Although now you can use like one of many different labels for your gender. You can pop in whatever label you want. But then it's reformulated back into traditional binaries deep in their coding system. And why is that? Because it's just easier for people to use binaries for basic marketing of their products. And so we can see how social structure is just really shaped around these binaries. And I use gender binaries, by the way, a lot because that's a lot of my work is around gender. But you can see it in race, you can see it in age, you can see it in almost any applied context. Now here's where, from a critical perspective, it becomes kind of fascinating. Binary language privileges one pole over the other. There is always one place, or almost always one pole of the binary that we think is superior. I talked about rationality and emotionality. Rationality in our society is privileged over emotionality, even though they're part of the same process. So here's an example that I find to be fascinating. In my organizational communication class last fall, I had 2 classes actually. In our textbook, it talked about these different types of leadership. We have transformational leadership, charismatic leadership, institutional leadership, and there's one other one I can't think of at the moment. But they each had criteria about what makes these particular types of leaders. So I got my students into groups and I said, why don't you identify leaders from each of these groups, or that fits each of these criteria. And then I had them write those leaders on the board. And guess what? All the leaders, every single one of the leaders they identified were men. All of them. They were just men. And I asked them, I said, have you never had good women leaders? And they're like, oh yeah, we've had great women leaders. And they were, once they thought about women, they were able to come up with some. And I'm like, well, why do we code then leadership as male? And then what is female? Is it followership, passivity? How are we coding gender here? But you can definitely see how masculinity becomes privileged over femininity when we're talking about leadership. Here's another interesting example. When I was preparing just this slide deck today, I was looking for images of a lion. So I typed in lion. And all the images except for one that popped up were male lions. To get pictures of female lions, I typed in lioness, and 2 images showed up. So by far, the most images, the dominant image of lion is male, which again, I find to be fascinating. Next, binaries are not singular. They're actually interwoven. And this is really important. Think about binaries as like a big tangle of yarn, or even as a really complex web of a spider. If you had just one binary, it'd actually be really easy to neutralize it through language by saying something like, men aren't opposite of women, or emotions aren't opposite of rationality. But when you get them like really entangled with each other, it becomes super hard to pick apart those threads. So you get these multiple interwoven binaries that appear impenetrable, and they trap language users in this kind of fixed system of meanings. The example that I came up with today is the opposite of a lion is a lioness, right? Lion is associated with king, and lioness then is the queen, and the king is in charge, and being in charge is a leader, being passive is a follower, and all of these things, all of them are their own binaries that entangle and become intertwined, making it really hard for us to pull them apart in any significant way. Next, binary logics are intersectional. And by this, I mean that binaries are enacted at the intersection of difference. Let me give you an example that I think is really interesting from the literature and the research with Black and white women. Black and white, of course, is a binary. And Black people and white people is treated as a binary, as oppositional. Yet, both Black women and white women in the workplace believe or feel that they cannot express anger at all, but for very different reasons. For Black women, they're not allowed to express anger because of the stereotype of the angry Black woman. And so to counter the stereotype of the angry Black women very often try to be emotionally neutral or positive. In contrast, white women also feel like they're not allowed to express anger. Why? Because of the nice white lady stereotype, where nice white ladies don't express anger. And if you express anger, then you are no longer fitting into that nice white lady stereotype and are considered inappropriate in the workplace. Very different reasons, of course, for why women are not allowed to express anger in the workplace, with more or less the same sort of behavioral action. You can also see the intersectional nature if you look at the U.S. I know not everybody here is embedded in the U.S. structure, but in the presidential race, because President Biden is older, he is assumed, therefore, to also be mentally unstable and disabled. So let's talk about how we can illustrate the binaries in applied work. Now, most of my research is on the workplace or on social class. And so that's one way that we can illustrate it. But I thought, now how can we stretch out of this boundary? How can what are some other ways that we can think about this, how binaries shape us? And so the first thing that I thought about was climate change. And here are some things I've heard people say from a climate change perspective, and see if you can come up with the binaries that are shaping this language. If it's cold today, like if we have a really cold winter storm, then global warming is wrong. Here's another one. Not me, but this is what I've heard from other people. I am a conservative / not a liberal. Conservatives are wise, not idiots. Wise people reject climate science. And then another one, people who don't believe in climate change are stupid. Okay. From here, you can probably identify at least some of the oppositional thinking that's shaping the conversations around climate change. And here's the deal. We're not doing enough. We're not treating it with the complexity that it deserves. There is a whole group of young people who are not saving for retirement because they see no future for themselves. They do not believe that this will ever be taken seriously by our various governments, and that they are going to die from climate change before they can ever retire. These people are in their 20s, maybe their early 30s, and they feel hopeless because we have not taken action, reasonable action, to prevent climate change. Identity, equity, and inclusion is one of the areas that I work in from a research perspective. And here's some things that I've actually heard people say. Racism is done by bad people. This is my insert, therefore not good people. I am a good person and I cannot be racist. Even though racism is systemic, it's built into the systems, it's not about the individual. And so we all do and experience and express racism in some way, good or bad. I mean, good people or bad people. Racism is never good. Here's one I heard recently. White women are all Karens, meaning that they're loud and obnoxious and openly racist. So not nice white ladies, right? I don't trust them at all. This was from a black man that said this to a white woman student in his classroom as a teacher. How do we ever address identity or inclusion, equity, and identity? How do we do that, right? If we are using this kind of oppositional language in our treatment of each other. I've been thinking a lot about the war in the Middle East and have had a number of conversations with it, and it's a highly complex problem. And yet I see people treating it in very simplistic ways. Okay. Here are some of the near quotes that I've seen from people. You either support Palestine or you support Israel. I am pro-Palestine because Jews are evil. I am pro-Israel because Palestinians are terrorists. You are either with us or against us. It's our side or their side. Do you see the problematic nature of these? How each of these taps into a binary in some really problematic way? I mean, here's the thing. History haunts this in really complex and interwoven ways. And we have people who have been terrorized in various ways, both Jewish people and the Islamic people there is a complexity to this problem that isn't addressed in any useful way by this type of language. So what do we do about this? How do we really think about binaries in a way that we can maybe make an impact as applied scholars? What can we do? Now, I don't have all the answers. Of course I don't. But I do have some suggestions. First of all, think about the hidden binaries in your own language, right? Think about it. Seek out the hidden binaries that shape the way that people are thinking and talking about any given problem. I almost guarantee that they will be present. Recognize that history always haunts the present. The problem with binary thinking is it tends to put things in the immediate now, as opposed to from a historical space. And so understanding history will help us understand the way that history haunts the present beyond binaries, which requires then that you use complex thinking. When somebody says it's simple, it's this or that, know that anytime we're talking about a complex problem in simplistic ways, it's almost always binary thinking. Utilize mindfulness. think about stuff beyond the knee-jerk reflexive response, which means that you need to slow down. Slow down. Think beyond the knee-jerk response. Slow thinking is the only way to get us past binary reasoning. And finally, and related to all the others, stop looking for simple solutions. We all want simple solutions, but our world is increasingly complex, especially because we haven't solved the problems as we've gone along. The longer we use simplistic binary thinking, the more complex the problems become, and the more entangled and wicked these problems become, and the harder it is for us to resolve them. So think beyond the simple solutions if you're going to really try to solve some of these important social problems that we're facing. Now, I was supposed to go 40 minutes, Mohan, and I think I underdid that. I'm sorry. But I really appreciate all of you here today, and I am open to your questions.
Thank you so much, Debbie, for that powerful conversation, and particularly inviting us to really think through interpretive frames and the ways in which we mobilize interpretive frames within the context of applied scholarship and applications broadly. For our Facebook and YouTube audience, please put your comments under the video and I will read them out to Debbie. And, for those on Zoom, please feel free to raise your hand and we can go from there. Debbie, perhaps, I want to start with sort of thinking about this context of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and give an example within this context. Let's say, we think of the settler colonial project, which is sort of based upon historic theft of indigenous land and that continues to perpetuate. Now, in Aotearoa, we have something called Te Tiriti, or the treaty that was signed between multiple tribes and the Crown. And that really is the foundational document. So what you then have here on an ongoing basis are the violations of the treaty, say to acquire on an ongoing basis Maori land. So, in the context of, say, the indigenous land occupations, the argument would be that that is itself a site of struggle, a site of struggle against settler colonial land occupation, and therefore needs to be thought of as a dialectic, particularly in terms of indigenous sovereignty, or what's called Tinoranga Tiratanga, and colonial occupation and theft. So I suppose, I would love to work with you in thinking through what then does this framework, what you're offering us in terms of thinking beyond binaries, offer in that kind of context where it is an oppositional struggle.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, first of all, I mean, I'm willing to bet, just especially based on what you have explained to me, that the entire conflict is built around binaries, whiteness versus, brownness or blackness. The European settlers, I'm guessing, versus indigenous people. And these are all framed as opposites in oppositional ways. And my bet, my just gut level response is that the entire conflict over who gets the land and who's the rightful owner is bound up in binary thinking, who's educated and who is not, what counts as education and what doesn't, what's civilized and what's not civilized. All of these things are oppositional. And I'm also willing to bet that the ongoing appropriation of Maori land is built around binary, who is deserving and who is not, right? And so thinking the immediate solutions, of course, in our brains go right to those binaries in terms of identifying the solutions. But solutions almost always need to go outside of the binaries. People talk about outside of box thinking, but we're not even that complex when you're working from binaries. Your thinking is more of a line, this or that. And so thinking through solutions from a binary perspective tends to put us back into the very thinking that got us here in the first place. I don't have an answer for how to resolve the problem, but my best guess is that the solution is going to have to come from beyond the binary thinking that usually drives us.
Sean, you have your video on, so please go for it.
Kia ora, Mohan. Mohan usually can, when the video appears, he can read that as as me offering to ask something. Debbie, thanks so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. It was very, very clear in highlighting how these binaries just function in these, it's kind of these banal ideological sort of frames for kind of making sense of everything. So I found that sort of very useful. But then I was also kind of thinking there's something productive about binaries too, in terms of, and I was thinking this actually links to a lecture I had earlier in the week, where the simple binary between the self and other became a very productive way for students to think about then the relationship between the self and other. So kind of exploring all of the terrain that you want us to be attuned to, but using the binary to sort of do that. So I have a second question, but would you want to talk about that first in terms of that the fact that binaries can also be productive, and they're also the self-other example isn't a bad one, because however we understand the other, there is a kind of foundational element to that in terms of how we all are, how we all experience the world and the embodied nature of experience and so on. So do you maybe want to talk to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that your statement is correct. It's functional. It functions for our society. It is the way that we have been trained to think. And so framing our teaching around binaries can be very helpful for students because they think in binaries. That's how we're trained to think. And so self-other is something that they can latch onto, that we can latch onto in training. It's one of the reasons why binaries are so prevalent, because that's just how we think. But if you drill down a little bit on the us versus them in terms of identity, right? In many cultures, it's not us or them, right? It's not me versus you. It's us. Our identity is based on us. And so separating my identity from your identity is a very foreign sort of concept to them. So while it seems natural because of our binary language and the way that we frame binaries, it is in fact a cultural sort of phenomenon. It works well in our culture because this is how we think.
Yeah, I like that, but I guess what I was thinking about as well is that getting, when you use this as a productive frame in class, you get students to think about how the self is constituted, and whether the self is kind of open to dialogue, engagement with the other on the other's terms, as opposed to having a kind of monstrous image of sort of otherness. And maybe I could link that to the second question, because I agree with you when you look at something like Israel, Palestine, and that a lot of the rhetoric can be in unhelpful ways kind of shaped and energized by this kind of binary logics. But at the same time, you talked about wanting to recognize the complexity of the conflict. And that can bring its own trap sometimes, because then you kind of get into a kind of centrist, a kind of sensible centrism, a tendency towards both siderism that can sometimes then be used to perhaps sometimes produce more subtle racist characterizations of the conflict. So do you know what I mean? At one level, a kind of politics that is too quick to go, oh, look at all these binary reductive ways of understanding what's going, this crude us and them politics. It's more complex than that, but that then becomes another way of introducing a new sort of binary that's more pernicious sometimes than a more obvious one. If that makes sense.
It does make sense. I mean, absolutely. Even the notion of both sides is kind of a binary, right? My focus in my research and my work is always solution oriented. And that means that I need to think about these things in more complex ways. But even that complexity can lead us into different binary traps because it's really hard to think outside of it. And honestly, a lot of times people are not in a place emotionally to solve a problem because the problem is so wicked in terms of really the shape of it. I don't know if I answered your question here, but it's not that I disagree with you. I just believe that a lot of times, even trying to think outside the binary leads us to more binaries, which lead us to more binaries. And so it becomes its own sort of trap.
You know, I think you've answered it clearly, because it's you escape one binary, or imagine yourself escaping one binary, but then you get entangled in these other layers of binaries, and you realize how much they shape so much of our kind of everyday discourse. So,
yeah, that's right. Thank you, John, for your question.
Mal, you have a comment here. Did you want to articulate that, or did you want me to read it out?
I'm not sure if you can hear me because I'm actually out and walking. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Oh, great. Okay. I really appreciate, the way this is going, and it's been very helpful. And it's been one of the things that when I was in Israel quite a few years ago, I had an incident where a Palestinian shopkeeper came into the hotel and started abusing a Palestinian front desk worker, a woman, because claiming that she had basically turned the hotel guest against his business. And the young Hebrew male colleague of this woman started defending the Palestinian woman. And that interested me. So I had a chat with them afterwards. And their point was, hey, we are both Israelis because we were born here. And Palestinians said, my family have lived here for, multiple generations. And same for that was the Jewish young man. And then the Palestinian woman, had the same story. And we're brothers and sisters. And what this guy is doing is attacking our family, if you like. And so we had a chat. And this is when I started thinking about, the background of the Taliban, rooted in Salafism and, ISIS is, I think, and the Taliban rooted in Wahhabism. And then I talked to my Jewish friends, and they said, look, our government is becoming Zionist. It's not Jewish. It's Zionism. And, you're entitled to your belief, but let's reframe it and stop talking about it being Jewish and Palestinian and identify what's behind this that's causing it. So that's, listening to you today, Debbie, has really sort of helped me sort of think about how I might reframe that. So thanks.
Good.
There we go. That's the comment.
Good. Yeah, I think, and that's the thing is that those who end up in power are those who can articulate best a binary position. Now, it's not exclusively that, of course. There are other things that put people in power, and I don't want to put everything down to binaries, but it's a really important part of why Hamas is in charge and why Netanyahu's government is in charge is because they have been able to frame for their people things in a very binary way. It's not the whole reason, and I'm by no means an expert on this, but it is their ability to frame things in binary ways beyond the ways that most of the people think in their various spaces.
Thank you for this conversation so far, and I'm really enjoying this. So Debbie, I'm going to push this a little bit. As an Indian, for instance, and a Bengali, I'm very much aware of that the British history of theft from largely Bengal that propelled the Industrial Revolution and the growth of Britain. And by the time the British left India, they stole close to $45 trillion from the Indian treasury. Right, that colonial history now is a materiality that one has to grapple with. In a similar kind of sense, when thinking about Israel and Palestine, one might argue that Israel as an entity comes through that colonial formation in terms of the role of the British, the role of the empire, and the large scale, if you think about the Nakba, the large-scale displacement and expulsion of Palestinian people. So Israel, in that sense, as we currently think of it as an entity, doesn't really exist outside of that colonial process. So I guess, a question for those of us that are grappling with that kind of balance of the colonial history as post-colonial subjects, or who are on an ongoing basis grappling with settler colonial violence. Even as we speak, Israel is carrying out violence, targeting Gaza, funded by the US, right? So the effect of this is ongoing. So I love this idea of needing to move beyond binary. But at the same time, I suppose, my question is, how does one do that when the immediate work within this context, you think about what South Africa is doing with the UN resolutions, is sort of the necessary work of calling out Israeli war crimes and holding Israel to account just to stop that violence. So I would love to get to that dialogic space where we are moving beyond the binaries. But it seems like the whiteness of the colonial project has set me up to be working in that place of struggle, so that lives are first saved before we can get to that place. I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it's so tough. I mean, because what do you do? What do you do? How do you do something? This sense of helplessness because it's so entrenched in this binary thinking. You think about, for example, we think about the material aspect of colonialism because it's tremendous. You said millions of dollars were stolen, and yes, and it's set India and back decades in terms of its cultural evolution. But one of the things we don't necessarily think as much about is the way that language itself colonizes, and that binary thinking may or may not have been a central part of, say, Indian culture before the West came in and colonized. So there is a colonization beyond just the material aspect, but also a meaningful aspect. And how do we find or refine a place where binary thinking isn't a central piece of a culture. So that's one of the things that I think about. I mean, in terms of the conflict, I do not have an answer. Like all of us, the answers require people who think in terms of binaries. We're either with you or we're not with you types of things. It requires them to take different actions. So, for example, the US government should make our support of Israel contingent upon Israel doing the right thing, taking certain actions, providing a place for the Palestinians to live. I don't see that happening, but that's really what we should be doing, in my opinion. But this is because of the binaries that we have between masculinity and femininity, and both of these parties their governments are run exclusively by men, and women are sort of hidden in the background. I kind of wonder what would happen if we put women in charge of this, using the binary. We type women, put them in charge. Women are not morally superior to men. But here's the thing, women leaders are always subject to suspicion. We are always objects of suspicion. We would never be allowed to do this type of violence. We would be removed from leadership in the same way that these men should be removed from leadership. So here you're capitalizing on your recognition of binaries as opposed to subverting binaries. So these are some of the things that I've personally been thinking about quite a bit. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm open to that possibility, but these are some of the things that I think about when I think about these conflicts in terms of binary thinking.
You know, Debbie, that is so beautiful, that prompt that you offered us in terms of what would the women leading these spaces look like, you know. And Mahbub has a question that is aligned with this. Mahbub, did you want to ask this?
Yeah, I can ask this. Thank you for your beautiful presentation. We always hear the term binary in piece of computer language. Binary means that there are only two possible values, 0 and 1. But it is good to learn the binary in applied communication context also. I have a question, because in the long history of US, we find that there has never been a woman president in the United States in its long history. So I would like to know your opinion in case of binary thinking, why the US people did not select a woman president.
Oh, man, such a great question. And I actually have a blog, if anybody's interested in it, where I talk a lot about gender and cultures. One of my most recent blog was about stereotypes faced by women and politicians that people can use to track the stereotypes that are being used to define the current presidential debate. And those stereotypes all tap into different binaries. And so what we get when I talk about binaries are interwoven, that's what I'm talking about. Each of these stereotypes taps into a different binary that is woven up with different binaries until gender and race and all of that stuff, to the point where it becomes really hard to disentangle them. And the only way to disentangle them is to do that in a very deliberate and thoughtful way, which is what the blog is supposed to give people an opportunity to do. I'm hopeful that we will get a woman president. I'm not a particularly big fan of the male nominee, but there's a possibility that he will win because he's male. And maleness is associated with leadership, and maleness is associated with power, and maleness is associated with capacity. So, I don't know. I'm hopeful.
Yeah, hope for the best, because this year also there is a woman candidate in the presidential race. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I placed the link to Debbie's blog here below. But Debbie, if you're comfortable, we can also share it on our socials right below the lecture so people can access it.
Oh, I'd love that. I love to have people come to the blog and to read it and to interact with me. And yeah, that would be great.
Awesome. Ming, I see you, and Sean, I see you on the screen. Did you all have any questions, or you wanted to come to the screen and say hi?
Can I, Ming, sorry, I'll let Ming.
Ming, go ahead.
Ming, unmute, please. You are muted. Thank you.
Hi, Debbie. Thank you very much for the presentation. And it's good to know this kind of binary thinking. And now, sometimes I think it's like sometimes we use the word paradox. Is that the correct word?
Mm-hmm. That's the correct word.
Yeah. And it seems that we are living in such a world, and that is the positive and negatives always go hand in hand. For example, on the one hand, the United States wants to improve the relationship with China, and the president says China, that is, the United States supports one China policy. But on the other hand, the United States sells weapons to to Taiwan. So that is, the United States is using this kind of binary thinking strategically. Am I right?
Yes, you're correct. That is correct.
Mm.
I feel like for most countries, and the United States included, we always need an enemy. It appears that we need an enemy, so we create one even when it's not necessary. We want to be our heroes, the heroes in our stories, and so to be a hero, I guess you have to have a bad guy. So we invent bad guys. That is binary thinking right there. In the China to Taiwan issue, is it one China, or is it Taiwan and China? Those are all very, very complex and entrenched problems. And thinking beyond that, the binary looks at what do people want, right? What do people want to have a good life? What do people in Taiwan want? Do they want to be part of one China, or do they want to be independent? And maybe that's a binary logic right there, right? Maybe there are other options or alternatives. I don't know, but it's a complex problem, and it is a paradox. You're 100% correct. And paradox, of course, is an extreme version of binary thinking. It's the logical sort of progression, as is, say, political polarization.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sure.
Yeah, just thinking through again the presentation in a sort of generative way. A lot of my own work is very much influenced by the tradition of people like Clow and Move, who would see these antagonistic dynamics at the heart of social life, which another way of reframing that is that we can wish that we want to subvert binaries and go beyond the binaries, but these binaries are kind of inescapable. And I think you can bring that back to the kind of self-other couplet. But then we wanted to link that point to what you said about the US election, because you're absolutely, it's clear that gender is a key factor in terms of steering people. But actually, I was just thinking about that refusal sometimes to confront the binary can sometimes lead to bad forms of politics. I agree. It's funny, I've been talking about this with students in class, because all the ridiculous alpha male archetypes that Trump surrounds himself sort of with and his supporters sort of reinforce. But where it has been successful in some sense as a kind of hegemonic politics is that the topic of masculinity is seen as a far right kind of topic. that when it comes to talking about men and what's going on for men and what are the issues faced by men and so on, that, and you know, some of my young men in my classes have said that they know how their peers and stuff are exposed to this stuff, and they don't maybe hear progressives, lefties, giving them repertoires for talking about this. Now, obviously, there's a whole literature on the sociology agenda where you could point to authors they could read, but it actually links, there's a very good, you might know it, a podcast series in the US called Know Your Enemy, which is done by two guys who have a background, one of them at least has a background as being part of kind of right-wing networks when he was younger, who are now very much kind of see themselves as on the left, social democratic left, and so on. But they had a really good episode on masculinity. And actually, one of the things they said, the left doesn't talk about this and doesn't give people resources for talking about this. So can you, again, there's a lot in that, but I guess it goes back to my fundamental point, or a criticism that you could make against the argument of wanting to transcend binaries, because we can't really escape them. You know, even what I'm doing now, I'm in the role of the person asking you a question. There's a kind of conflictual dynamic to that interaction that is hard to escape, and how maybe I'm thinking about what I'm saying and how you're thinking how you're going to respond to what I'm saying, and how other people might be observing the conversation, even if it, you know what I mean, even when it's done here in a friendly way. But you can think of, we know lots of encounters at academic gatherings where it's not done. There's a clear kind of overperformance of a kind of antagonistic dynamic. So
yeah. So I would like to separate just a little bit for you the conflict and binary thinking. We use binary thinking often in conflict, but they're not the same thing. You can have complex conflicts or conflicts that are antagonistic and yet also not binary. So those are very different. Maybe not very different, but they're different, right? Different things. Well, we will always have conflict. People in all cultures have had conflicts, even when those cultures are not embedded in binary logics in the same way that most Western cultures are. So that's one thing. I have been thinking so much about the masculinity issue. And I talk about this in my book. If you're at all interested in the book, it's sexual harassment. I have a copy of it here somewhere, but it's Sexual Harassment in Organizational Culture, a Transformative Approach. I talk about gender and masculinity and femininity and how they're framed in these kind of binary ways. And those binaries are very tough to overcome, and they wander their way into organizational context and create the possibility of sexual harassment even existing. So if you're interested in a conversation about masculinity, that would be actually a nice place to go to. I also do talk about it on my blog, and I have a couple of blogs that I think are helpful for men wanting to think differently about masculinity outside of the right-wing context. And so some of them, like one of the blogs, What's Going On with This Man Thing, is one of people's favorites. A couple others, one where I contrast, what's a positive masculinity? I mean, take a look at Jimmy Carter and versus bad, toxic masculinity, taking a look at Andrew Tate. So there is, I'm not sure if it's a left wing or if it's simply an academically informed and hopefully fun way for men to read about alternative masculinities. But the way that hegemonic masculinity, that's a dominant type of masculinity in Western culture, the way that it's formed is that it's unachievable and it's like extreme. Like there's a central, like this is masculinity right here. And the closer you are to this unachievable masculinity, the more power you have in our society. And so men are constantly trying to push towards this type of masculinity that only exists maybe in comic strips or superheroes. And when they see women doing that, that's the opposite of masculinity. And so they have to push even more towards some of these things, such as particular types of male violence that only men can do. And so we see this kind of extreme movement among some young men towards violent masculinity. And I think current types of masculinity are traumatic for people on all levels. It's just a truly traumatic experience being a man, I think. The expectation of violence, the expectation that you need to be violent to be a man, the whole idea of manning up and not crying. I mean, these are horrendous things that men are expected to display, and it's just terrible. So these are some of the things I write about in my blog when it comes to masculinity. And interestingly enough, I would say that those blogs that I have on masculinity are my most popular.
Thanks, Debbie. Yeah, it was Andrew Tate. It was a discussion about Andrew Tate. That was one of the reasons why this came up in class, just as him point.
And he's a horrible man. I mean, he's a truly deeply.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you know,
his whole body, the way he just comports himself, is just fascistic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you know, the thing I was going to say is that the ways in which particular ideas of masculinity thinking about Andrew Tate are organized then around hate and violence, and almost mobilizing toward fascist violence is so powerful to witness. And you know, I was going to share this analogy with my research on the Indian context, Debbie. I love that you brought up the decolonizing register. So if you think about Hindu mythological traditions, right? You have fluidity between the male and female forms. So the deity of Ardhanarishwara, right, was half man, half woman, embodies the idea that Shakti, the female form of power, and Shiva are connected together in the womb. And that's where the interplay comes from, and that becomes the basis for diverse gender articulations, but also it takes the idea of time and decolonizes it with the idea that at different points one might express different moods or emotions that might be seen as masculine, feminine, or going back and forth, right? But, you know, one of the things, so if you look at Indian deities like Lord Ram, you know, who is an icon that is, you know, in the Hindu epic Mahabharata, Ramayana becomes the anchoring feature in the struggle for justice. And Ram is portrayed in quite feminine ways in iconography. So if you look at the images of Ram, you would see the images to be fluid, the idols to be fluid. But as Hindutva, the far-right fascist movement has turned Ram into an icon around which it has organized. The image of Ram has become more and more male, more and more angry, more and more masculine, ready to launch the war on Muslims. So it is organized around Ram the fighter. You know, so it's also interesting how movements then mobilize particular features of culture to draw upon these masculinist narratives to then mobilize violence.
Yeah, you can start to see the colonization of masculinity with Western notions of hegemonic masculinity in those images, those core images of Indian culture, and it's super sad and just devastating. Yeah.
We are at 11:09. Perhaps we can take one more question as we wrap up. Thank you for this beautiful conversation, Debbie. You gave us so much to think through. Richard, can we do a quick scan of our platforms to see if there are any questions? Otherwise, we can start wrapping up. I don't see any questions here. So Debbie, one last question. You spend a lot of time developing training programs, say for instance, in organizational settings, working in business or corporate contexts. So what is your experience in a nutshell, trying to bring these concepts into organizational context, particularly when thinking about power and control and trying to build diverse registers around that?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think that, well, here's the thing. My favorite clients are learning clients. They're people who are open to learning and to thinking. They don't want me to come, I mean, maybe they want me to, but they don't expect me to come in and solve their problems for them. They want to learn how to solve their own problems, and they're open to these kind of big ideas that can filter down into really good solutions. And I've discovered that I don't work as well with people who are looking for the solution right now. I just don't, in part because that never works. We took years and years and years to create these problems. We cannot solve this problem in one 30-minute training session. So, I hope that answers your question, Mohan.
Yeah, and thank you for, in so many ways in our discipline, for being a key figure in negotiating these spaces and continually bringing theory into action. I think you're so inspiring in the work that you do, Debbie, precisely because you're engaged in developing this very kind of practical ways of working through these tensions.
Oh, you're so welcome. I appreciate your graciousness and this conversation. It gives me so much pleasure and positive spirit. I'm much gratitude to you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Debbie. Thank you to our audience for joining in. As you can see, this lecture series takes us into directions that really gives a lot of great food for thought. Thanks once again.
Thanks.